Today I'm going to go over the vegetation requirements for the city of Sanibel. And you all have a marker pen. And I'll remind you of this again, when I tell you that this is something that's going to be included in your final exam, you do well to mark it on and use your highlighter to indicate that. This test, let me tell you first that the test is going to be an open book test. In other words, you'll have all of this material in front of you. The test questions directly follow the material in the vegetation standards, so that when you see a question, and then the next question will not be something that you need to go back and look for. It should be progress right through the materials. So, the vegetation requirements of the City of Sanibel were based on the City of Sanibel Land Development Code. And you'll see that there's a reason for this, and it's very structured. And I want you to think about reading through everything that's in the material. Everything is not going to be on the exam, and everything isn't going to apply all the time. But what you need to do is to make sure that you're familiar with it, and so that you can help homeowners understand the reason behind what's written in here. And it's very straightforward, makes a great deal of sense. And it certainly has helped us to keep the Sanibel plan and what you see on the walls here in mind, and also to follow those instructions. Now, the first thing that I'm going to mention is the information sheet under the Land Development Code, and that's on page 4 probably in your material. Should be on page 4. And at the very bottom, it talks about contractors working with vegetation on the island. All vegetation contracting work in the City of Sanibel must be supervised on site by a homeowner or by a vegetation contractor duly certified under the provisions of the Sanibel Land Development Code. Now that's it is the basis for what we're going to be talking about. So you have a plant list, and we'll go over that later. And I'm going to want you to continue on, and we're going to be talking about Division 3, vegetation contractors. And the purpose of this is to preserve and protect vegetative resources within the city. So keep turning your pages, because I want you to go to, first we're going to talk about commercial sites.
What page number are you on?
I am on page 9. And it is section 122-47, vegetation buffers. And the next section is the location and size of required vegetation buffers. If I go too quickly, you will need to tell me. Sometimes I'm familiar with the material, and I tend to just proceed right along. So if you have any questions also, be sure you put up your hand, and we'll deal with it right at the moment. The location and size of required vegetation buffers. And this is in the commercial area. And the vegetation buffer should be at least 20 feet in depth, located adjacent to the right-of-way of any street, except for Periwinkle, between Causeway Road and Tarpon Bay Road. That's the area that protects the commercial district from the street, and that's the vegetation buffer that's along the street. Then there are also vegetation buffers on either side of the property. And if you go down to number 3, this is also important. At least vegetation buffers at least 15 feet in depth should be located along all side lot lines. Okay, next page. Types and varieties and numbers of plants required. So we're going to go right through 1, 2, 3, 4. 1. Each, and remember this is something that you're going to need to know. Each required vegetation buffer shall include at least one large or medium tree for each 75 square feet of the required buffer area, with a minimum of 6 different species of native plants included. 2. Each required vegetation buffer shall include at least one small tree or shrub for each 30 square feet of the required buffer area. Number 3, each required vegetation buffer shall include at least one low-growing, that would be small shrub or ground cover plant, for each 25 square feet of the required buffer area, with a minimum of 3 different species of native plants included. And it's important to know that grasses and vines are not required or should not be used to satisfy that requirement. Number 4, minimum of 75% of the plants required by each of the subsections shall be native plants. And you're going to hear this over and over again. Native plantings have so much value, and that we'll be discussing that later in this material. But the very fact that it's going to be repeated, the number of minimum of 75% of the plants, that's what we'd like everybody to have. 75% native, 25% non-native, non-exotic, but not non-invasive. Down the bottom of the page, installation standards. You've already picked the number of plants. You know how many plants of each size need to go into this buffer. Now we're talking, and this is important, the quality of plants used in the vegetation buffer shall conform to the standards of Florida number 1 or better. That's number 2 at the bottom of that page. Okay, next page. It tells us that we already know the type of plants, we know the quality of plants. Now we need to hear about the size, because you can't be planting everything all the same size, the smallest plants that you can find. So, large and medium trees installed in a vegetation buffer and existing preserved large and medium trees used to meet the requirements of this division must be a minimum of 8 feet for medium trees and 12 feet for large trees. Then it tells you that, skip that next sentence, but next small trees must be a minimum height of 6 feet and shrubs a minimum height of 18 inches. So we've covered the plants. So we'll go on, keep turning your page, and this next section covers the very same thing, but for residential areas along arterial and collector roads, so that it's a repetition of what we've just talked about, because the requirements are basically the same. Okay, now you've got the next thing you come to are definitions. We'll be talking more about those later, but I want you to go to page 16. Does everybody have that? Because you've got all of those plants planted. Okay, what if somebody says, I don't really want that there. I don't really like that. So, the very top of the page, material alteration of vegetation. What does that mean? 1, the removal of native vegetation that is 2 inches or greater in diameter or any point more than 2 feet above ground level or 6 feet or more in height, or the removal of shrub-like native plants that are more than 2 feet in height, or the removal, transplanting, or pruning, trimming of any threatened or endangered native plant regardless of size, or the removal of any native vegetation in excess of the maximum vegetation clearance limitations, and we'll talk about those later. So this is a good thing for you to be able to interpret to a homeowner. Okay, native plant. So then they say, well, what is a native plant? And going down the page, in the middle of the page, there's it says native plants. And arbitrarily, it's been decided that those plant species whose natural range included Florida at the time of the European contact, that would be 1500 AD, as identified in the Atlas of Vascular Plants website. And you can refer people to it. You might look at it yourself. See, it's a very interesting website. So there are more definitions, and we're going to talk about some of those later. But okay, let's say somebody decides they're going to do that, and they on their own, and go to the bottom of page 17. And now we're going to talk about penalties. There is a penalty for anyone who violates any of the vegetation requirements or standards of the code. You need to replace the foliage with the same type of vegetation that was destroyed. And if you, for example, let's talk about somebody wants to take down a strangler fig that's growing under their sidewalk or planted too close to the house. And that's understandable and that's allowed. Now you need a permit for that. We'll talk about that later. But that if they do that, then they do need to replace that tree. It says on the next to last sentence, may require the installation of 3 or more plants for each plant destroyed. Replacement vegetation may be required to be installed off-site where there is not sufficient area on the site of the vegetation destruction. Quite frankly, I've never seen that, but I suppose that it would happen if somebody had so many plants in their yard. It could be planted here on city property. All right, moving right along, and we're going to talk about now the permit as part of a development permit. Go to page 19, section 122, 144. A request for a vegetation permit must be made by the owner of the lot or the owner's designated agent. Usually, almost always, it's the building contractor. And they must include a map of the sub 1 through 4 here, a map of the subdivision showing the location of the parcel, a site plan showing where they're going to put the driveway, the swimming pool, or any other structure, and it must be staked, and a vegetation plan which complies with the land development code must be included in it. Next page. Okay, what does that vegetation plan need to include? And remember, these are all things that are going to be on your exam. So I want you to have highlighted them all, and I'm happy to go back and clarify anything. A, what does it include? An inventory of all the native vegetation. How many Fakahatchee grass are there within the area to be disturbed, the number and the species. Then you need to locate and identify on a site plan all native vegetation within the area to be disturbed that is either 2 inches or greater in diameter and or 6 feet or more in height. And that could be things like wild olive, wild coffee, indigo berry, whatever, that are more than 2 feet in height. And then D, you need to make a plan for any of that native vegetation that's going to be removed, for a plan for irrigating the transplanted vegetation. Now, what I usually see is that those plants are taken up. The driveway, where you're going to put the driveway is full of an area of wild coffee. Okay, so it needs to be transplanted, and usually people put a ditch and fill the plants in, backfill them, and make a plan for watering them and keeping them in good condition. Transplants must be marked with colored engineering tape so they can be distinguished from other non-transplanted vegetation. And you have to leave that tape on the transplant until the final inspection. Okay, any questions? Right. Removal of native species. And I mentioned permits before and earlier, and a permit is required for the removal of native trees over 6 feet in height or more than 2 inches in trunk diameter, 2 feet above the ground, or native shrub-like plants such as wild olive, wild coffee, white indigo berry, etc., that are more than 2 feet in height. Down in section 122, below that, anything else requiring a permit? Go down to number 3. You also need a permit for removal of invasive exotic vegetation from undeveloped property by handheld equipment or otherwise. And that's part of the preparation of a site to be inspected. Okay, now, important for you to remember as well is at the top of page 21, you also need a permit if you're going to prune or trim more than 25% of the leaf area of any native tree or shrub over 6 feet or in height or more than 2 inches in diameter, 2 feet from the ground. Now, just envision the fact that sometimes people, they're away, they're not here, and they let that strangler fig grow out over their pool cage, and oh my gosh, they should have had it trimmed last year, but they didn't. And now it's so big that if it should break, it's going to fall right on their pool cage, etc., and so forth. So it's possible to get that trimmed, but you just need to have a permit, which means that somebody from the Vegetation Committee will come out, take a look at it, say, oh yeah, they should have trimmed this before. And so then they'll get probably, most likely, a permit to have you do that. And the homeowner will have that. Inspection permits, procedures for obtaining a vegetation permit right under that, which is pretty much what I just said. Vegetation permits are issued by the city manager or the City of Sanibel Planning Department, and that's what happens here in Sanibel, following an on-site inspection of the subject property by a member of the City Vegetation Committee or a city staff member. And that vegetation, this is important, that vegetation permit is normally valid for 6 months. And the homeowner will have a copy of that so you can see it. Going on down the page, following up after that inspection. The second sentence, at least one follow-up inspection may occur between 6 months and a year after the issuance of a completion certificate for the development or the site alteration. At the time of the follow-up inspection, Plants that have not survived shall be replaced with plants similar in size and species. So the other part of that too is that remember we talked earlier, and one of our requirements is that you need to mitigate. So if you've removed a tree, then the mitigation efforts will be a part of that inspection. Okay, grounds around buildings. Generally, section 122, 149, generally a vegetation permit is not required for mowing, pruning, trimming, planting, or transplanting on parcels of land where there's an existing dwelling or commercial or institutional building, except that a vegetation permit is required for any alteration of vegetation growing seaward of the 1974 coastal construction control line, except for the mowing of existing non-native grasses around existing buildings. And we'll be talking about that area that the CCCL line designates. And you also, and this is very important, I don't know if there are any mangrove trimmers in the audience, but they can explain that even better to you when you're done. But any trimming or alteration of mangroves requires a permit, and that's a specific purpose. That's done in a different kind of a way, but definitely we don't cut our mangroves. Removal of any native plant which is over 6 feet in height or which is over 2 inches in diameter at 2 feet above ground. Let's say the homeowner wants to, and I had this happen, I wanted to move a thatch palm. There were too many of them altogether. So I just came to the city and said, I've got too many of these palms growing together, and I would like to move one. And so I didn't move it myself, but I asked my landscaper to do that for me. And I did have need to get a permit for that. And you also need a permit for the pruning or trimming of more than 25% of the leaf area of any native tree, bush, or shrub over 6 feet in height, or 2 inches or more in diameter, 2 feet above the ground. Shorelines and bodies of water. Now, B. A vegetation permit is required for chemical control of aquatic plants. But what you need to know to answer this question is that the Lee County Hyacinth Control District can apply chemicals, or the owner can hire a contractor licensed by the state to apply Environmental Protection Agency approved chemicals. Which makes me think that I just want to tell you that the questions that will be on your exam, some of them may be either or, and some of them, many of them, are going to be multiple choice. When you have a multiple choice question, it will give you can do this if you do whatever. And so you've got choices. You've got A, B, C, and D. Now, A may be correct, B may be correct, C, but be sure you look at D, which may say all of the above. So it's very important to read the question carefully. And remember that the questions follow this material, go right straight through it in an order. Okay, bottom of the page. Requirements for staking and taping. Now, you can't go out and inspect anything if you don't know some things about it. So, A, in that section, says that the lot corners need to be staked. And of course, that's important. That's how you find out where it is. In B, it's important that all the buildings be also marked, and also septic tanks. We don't have those on the island now, but drain in pools and driveways we do. So it's very important to know where those things are going to go, because they may very well have native vegetation growing in them that will need to be moved. The coastal construction control line. Any property that's crossed by the 1974 CCCL line shall have that line marked on the ground with conspicuous wooden stakes and surveyor's tape or durable waterproof string, and shall be clearly labeled. Now that's very important, because but you're just going to see it probably. I mean, you are going to see it along the Gulf properties. Because that area seaward of that line is a whole other area to be protected. So the lot may be staked, but then there'll be another staking of that line so that you know where that division is. Okay, now one of my favorite questions. Section 122, 168, planting limitations under overhead power lines. Second sentence, trees or shrubs that exceed 20 feet in height at maturity shall not be planted within 10 feet either side of the vertical plane of the center line of the existing overhead power lines. That doesn't include the service line, which is the phone line, but I distinctly remember going to look at a property where they planted a whole row of mahoganies right under the power lines, and they all had to come down, and the owner had to replace them 3-to-1, because that's what the ruling has said that we just covered a few minutes ago. And so you need to help people understand that. All right, landscaping requirements. Let's go to section 3 under that. New development or redevelopment. All right. At least 75%, here we go again, by count of all in-ground shrubs, ground cover, and trees, including landscaping, will involve only the use of native species. And similar, as I mentioned before, the remainder of that remaining 25% can be non-competing exotic species that are not invasive. Landscaping of a parcel seaward of that CCCL line, which is, we can think of it as the beach Gulf zone, shall only involve the use of native plants. And the Florida Administrative Code, and it gives you the number there, also requires that all plants installed in beach and coastal areas shall be native species. Now, for the purpose of this calculation, Australian pine is included as a non-native species. Australian pine is not allowed to be planted by the state of Florida anywhere on a property, and so we of course have seen a lot of Australian pines, and during our hurricanes they almost always come down. So next and final paragraph here is the in-ground native plants installed or existing on the parcel to meet the landscaping requirements of this section shall be distributed so that 75% native plants by count requirement is met within each of the categories of native plants: trees, shrubs, and ground covers. Okay, page 24.